Welcome to Dear SQL DBA, podcast for SQL Server database administrators. I'm Kendra Little. This week, we are going to talk about monitoring blocking in SQL Server. Here's our question. Dear SQL DBA, what is the best way to set up blocking and deadlock alerts on the server? I want to be notified automatically without any impact on the production server. I've tried alerts with SQL Server performance conditions in the SQL Server agent, but they don't show the queries or the tables involved, etc. Thanks, all blocked up. Now, this is a fantastic question, and I think all blocked up that what you want me to focus on is the free built-in things that come with SQL Server, like those alerts in the SQL Server agent. So I'm going to talk about those today. But for others who are listening, if you do have budget for monitoring your SQL Server, for your most critical instances, you can buy monitoring tools that have been honed to have customized alerts, collect and graphically display for you exactly who is blocking who, for how long, what were their execution plans, deadlock graphs, all sorts of stuff. But we don't always have the budget to do that for every SQL Server instance that we have. And just because we don't have monitoring budget doesn't necessarily mean that an instance isn't important. So knowing what free tools are available built into SQL Server for this is really important for almost every DBA out there. And that's what I'm going to talk about today. So I'm not saying that this is better than stuff you can pay extra for. I'm just saying a lot of times we need this stuff, right? And a quick note for anyone who's listening to the podcast who's going to be at the SQL Pass Summit in Seattle next month. It's in less than a month. In 2016, I will be giving a session on Thursday at the Pass Summit about this very topic. I'll be walking through different scenarios on locking and blocking and showing how to use these free tools to solve them. The session is called The Great Performance Robbery, Locking Problems and Solutions. It's on Thursday at 10:45 a.m. Right now it's scheduled to be in room 60. Sometimes rooms get changed, so check the schedule if you're going to be at the summit. There will be tons of demos in sample code. In the podcast today, I'll just be giving an overview. That session at Pass is more than an hour, right? So I have a lot more time to cover ground, plus, big projector. It's going to be tons of fun. So how does SQL Server help us solve these problems? I'm going to talk about combining multiple free tools. Our questioner is absolutely right that just a simple alert doesn't give us all the information we need. But I actually think the alert is still useful. We just have multiple parts to the solution. So the first part is, how do I get notified when blocking happened so I can get to the SQL Server? Because I don't want to have to wait for a user to tell me that things were slow. When the user tells me things were slow, I want to be able to say, yep, I got a notification for this 5 minutes ago and I'm working on investigating, right? So the SQL Server agent lets you set up what are called alerts that can notify you. And the way to do this for blocking, the simplest, most lightweight way is to use a performance counter alert. When you create the alert, you tell it, hey, it's based on a perf counter. And the performance counter you want is under SQL Server General Statistics. It's called Processes Blocked. And you can say, hey, send me an email if more than 0 processes are blocked. And like our questioner said, it's not going to tell you what's involved in it, but it's going to tell you need to look at the SQL Server. To get this to work, you need to configure a few things on your SQL Server. And you generally want to configure these anyway. You need to set up database mail. You need to configure the SQL Server agent properties to use the database mail profile you set up and then restart the SQL Server agent. You need to create an operator in the SQL Server agent that has your contact info. And the operator is kind of cool. It can be your email address, and most of our phones these days, you have an email address associated with SMS messages for you. So if you want to get a text message, you can configure that as an email address in the operator. And then on the alert itself, you tell it, hey, when this alert fires, when more than 0 processes are blocked or whatever your threshold is, I want you to notify this operator. I also recommend that you look carefully at the alert properties and go through every tab, because you probably also want to tell the alert, hey, only notify me every 5 minutes. One text message is enough. The agent will pull these counters approximately every 15 to 30 seconds. It's not guaranteed. And you don't really want to get a text message every 15 seconds, most likely. If one is probably enough, but you could stress test the operator if you really needed to, right? So look at all the properties of the alert. If you need something that is going to be more sensitive than and I would say just, kind of assume that it may be every 30 to 45 seconds that it pulls. If you need something more sensitive than that, that is a sign that the built-in tools inside that one SQL Server instance may not be sufficient to your needs. If that instance is so sensitive to performance that you need really fine-grained notifications, you really do want an external monitor coming in and regularly looking at the SQL Server, because in that case, any interruption in connecting to the SQL Server is probably going to matter a ton to you as well, and you're going to care about a lot of other stuff too. So this is kind of just a basic general thing. It's not super fine-grained, but that's actually a good thing for most of us because we do want it to be really lightweight. The lighter weight something is, usually the less sort of fine-tuned it is. So test out some blocking. Make sure that your notification is working. That's step number 1. Step number 2 is figuring out which queries are involved in the blocking. So when I get notified, I'm going to go look at the SQL Server and I want to be able to see collected for me, and it may take me a few minutes to get there, what blocking was happening 3 minutes ago or 5 minutes ago or 10 minutes if I went to go get some coffee, outside the building. I like to use the built-in blocked process report for this, and I think it's a fantastic tool. It's lightweight because SQL Server has to do a bunch of the work anyway. SQL Server has something called the Deadlock Monitor that regularly wakes up and looks around and says, is there blocking between queries that they can't resolve themselves? Are there queries who are fighting for locks in a way that they are stuck and they cannot make progress? If there are, I need to break that up. So by default, SQL Server is going to wake up every 5 seconds and look at locking and blocking anyway. By configuring something called the blocked process threshold in SP configure, you tell it, hey, at this interval that I specify, you might specify 5 seconds, you might specify 30 seconds, but at this interval, I want you, when you're looking at the blocking, to issue a report about who's blocking whom on the SQL Server. You don't want to set this lower than 5 seconds because you don't want the Deadlock Monitor running constantly. That can actually hurt your performance. Usually it's good to start at about 30 seconds. So every 30 seconds, if there's blocking, issue this report and I will pick it up with a trace. So you configure the blocked process threshold in SP configure, and then you need to set up a trace. You can do this with SQL Trace and set up a server-side trace, or you can do this with extended events. And there is one trace event that you want to pick up called the blocked process report. And it's just an XML description of all the blocking in the SQL Server. So you set this up as a trace, either server-side trace or extended events trace, and it just saves it off to a file so that when you get that notification, you go look at the SQL Server, you open up your trace and say, was there trace? Was there blocking? and who was blocking whom. And if you're doing it every 30 seconds, if there was blocking for 5 minutes, you'll see a report every 30 seconds, and you'll actually be able to see how the blocking started, what it was like 30 seconds later, if it had changed at 30 seconds after that. Because sometimes we actually do have situations where it starts with one process blocking, and then the chain behind it grows. Maybe that first process finishes, and then it takes a while for the blocking to clear out. So you can actually see the whole progression of it over time. Really cool. It can be hard to read. It's a bunch of pieces of XML. There's a free tool written by a community member who's awesome called Michael Swart. Thanks, Michael, if you're listening, for writing awesome free tools. It's called the Blocked Process Report Viewer. It's code that you can use on your production server itself, or you can take that trace file you saved off, you can copy it to a dev environment, and you can use the Blocked Process Viewer there. So you don't even have to install it on production if you don't want to, which is awesome. What the Blocked Process Report Viewer does is it takes all that data and it'll look at all of the pieces of who is blocking who, and actually you run it in SSMS. It'll return it to you in Management Studio and show you, here was the lead blocker at this time, and here's who they were blocking. And on each one, you can click and open up and see the text that came out of the blocked process report that contains things like the input buffer for the command. It may not be the whole query. It's just basically the same as you would see if you were using DBCC input buffer. It'll give you a head start figuring out who was blocking who, but like if it was a query that's thousands of characters long, it's just going to give you the beginning. So it'll give you a head start on finding it out. It'll tell you what the login name was, and when there's lock weights, what type of lock weight it was. So you'll figure out who was it, what kind of thing were they running, and how many things were blocked. How long did it last? Really, really useful information. The trace is pretty lightweight. Just trace it, because I'm just talking about tracing that one blocked process report event, right? Which is that report that's being emitted. I personally don't like leaving traces running forever. Whenever you have any kind of trace running, you need to look at, did it fill up the drive, right? How many files has it produced? You need to clean up with after it periodically. And I'm going to go ahead and warn you too. I said server-side trace. If you don't know what that is not leaving the profiler app running. SQL Server's built-in profiler app, it's usually problematic. Trying to figure out how to say this diplomatically. So I have seen the profiler app do a variety of things that are a problem. Slow down the SQL Server, depending on what people are collecting. When run for long periods, I've seen it even crash the SQL Server. Even if you tell profiler, save the results to a drive over there, there's basically temporary files it creates along the way that by default, it'll put on your system drive. There's complicated ways to change those, but it's much easier to look up, how do I script a server-side trace? Or alternately, on more recent versions of SQL Server, use an extended events trace and just don't use the profiler app, right? So big warning, friends don't let friends use the profiler app. And some people are going to be offended by this, right? No matter what you say about tracing, someone's going to be offended. That's just kind of a law of talking about tracing, right? So that's the blocked process report, which I think is awesome. Now, what about deadlocks? Deadlocks, I mentioned that the deadlock manager by default wakes up every 5 seconds. So we're likely to see queries involved in a deadlock. We're likely to see them if we're running the blocked process report, depending on the interval we're running it at. We might be running it at every minute, and a deadlock might happen, when it's not running. Deadlocks also, we want to know more about than just who is blocking who. In a deadlock, the commands are actually blocking each other, and there can even be more than two. It can be really complicated. What I think is very useful when working with deadlocks And I'm not going to say it makes it easy because deadlocks is often hard. I'm not going to say there's having someone else work with the deadlock is the only thing that might make working with a deadlock easy. But getting the deadlock graph is what I think is very helpful. That is a picture of the fight that was happening at the time that SQL Server stepped in and was like, no, you're the victim, and you're the victim, and you're the victor, or whatever it decided needed to happen to resolve that deadlock. So what you really want to know is, okay, what were who was locking what and who was waiting on what in this deadlock situation? Getting that picture is something that is also done with a trace. The deadlock graph event can be picked up by a server-side SQL trace or by an extended events trace. You can then copy the graph off and then interpret it elsewhere. And I think that's the most useful thing. There's other options. There's legacy trace flags in SQL Server that you can turn on that tell SQL Server, hey, when there's a deadlock, can you print some information to the SQL Server error log? Now, that's not a bad thing, but what I've generally found is that doesn't give me enough information to resolve the deadlock. It will give you the input buffer of the queries involved, but it doesn't give you all of the information that's in that graph. So when the trace flag is telling you, hey, there's deadlocks, usually your next step is, okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and collect the deadlock graph. My feeling is, okay, I want to do sort of a notification on blocking in general to let me know if I have blocking. And then I'd rather just go ahead and collect deadlock graphs. And if I'm seeing blocking, I can look if my deadlock trace is picking stuff up and look at what the deadlock graph is. So I'm not against turning on those trace flags if you really want to look at the error log. I just find that usually isn't enough for me to solve the problem. Really good resource for how to capture and start handling deadlock information is Jonathan Cahias wrote an excellent article on Simple Talk called Handling Deadlocks in SQL Server. The article is actually an excerpt from a book he wrote, but it goes through different ways you can collect the deadlock information, that deadlock graph event. He also talks about what the trace flags are too, if you're curious about those trace flags. And he shows examples of what the deadlock graph looks like and talks about how to start tackling them. All right, so very cool information. And again, the name of that article is Handling Deadlocks in SQL Server. It's on Simple Talk by Jonathan Cahias. If you want to get really fancy, there is actually a cool post out there that was written by Michael Swartigan, the fellow who wrote the Blocked Process Report Viewer. He has a recent post called Build Your Own Tools that he wrote on his blog. And what he wanted to do is he said, well, when there's a deadlock, I actually want to try to collect the query execution plan myself. And he did this using event notifications. An event notification is sort of event-driven processing in SQL Server, where you say, hey, when X happens, I want you to do Y and maybe Z. This is a little complex to get working. This is not for the beginners. This is kind of if you've progressed through everything so far and you then need to get fancier, because this event notifications, they use Service Broker behind the scenes. So you need to research Service Broker and make sure you're comfortable using all of these tools. It's just, it's going to take some time. But basically, you can use Service Broker to say, hey, when there is a deadlock, fire this sequence of events and collect this information. And he shared the code that he used to say, hey, I want to try to see if I can get the execution plan from the cache when this happens. It's very interesting. This is definitely more expert mode than everything else I've talked about here, but I wanted to include it because I think it's cool on writing your own tools, but you got to be careful and make sure that you can support your own tools when you do that. So quick recap of everything we've talked about. For notifications, I love those simple light alerts in the SQL Server agent using the performance alert for the number of processes blocked. I like the built-in blocked process report to say, hey, who's involved in the blocking? Who's blocking who? That is set up using spconfigure, as well as setting up either a server-side trace or an extended events trace looking for the blocked process report event. And then for deadlocks, I think deadlock graphs are the most useful thing, and collecting those with a server-side trace or an extended events trace is the way to go there. If you would like to submit a Dear SQL DBA question, I would love to get it. Questions can be simple, they can be complex, they can be technical, they can be about office politics, all sorts of stuff. Head on over to littlekendra.com and click on Dear SQL DBA in the menu. Submitting a question is really easy, and of course, it's always free. I'm always happy to get your questions. Thanks for joining me today, and I'll see you next week on Dear SQL DBA.